So, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all doing great and happy after the great victory of the Moroccan national football team over Canada yesterday in the World Cup. I would like to congratulate the Moroccan national football team, all Moroccans, and all football fans on this wonderful achievement. We wish them continuous success in the upcoming matches. So, before embarking on today's lecture, I would like to thank Beit Lisaniyat for organizing such valuable lectures and webinars. In particular, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Mr. Ahmed bin Isa, Dr. Yasmina Chara, and all the other members of Beit Lisaniyat team for their continuous efforts and dedication. Today's lecture is entitled The Colonial Thought from Within, Rahman, Taha, Gaza, and the Ethic of Entrustment. In this lecture, we will explore how the colonial thought examines the continuing effects of colonialism and coloniality, and how the Moroccan philosopher Taha Abdurrahman offers an Islamic ethical perspective based on moral responsibility, entrustment, and covenant. The lecture also reflects on the significance of these ideas in light of the situation in Gaza and discusses how Islamic philosophy can contribute to the contemporary debates on justice and decolonization. So, before we give the floor to our esteemed professor, I would like to introduce him first. So, Professor Ashraf Qunoni Idrisi is an assistant professor of humanities and social sciences in the College of Arts, Education, and Social Sciences at the Abu Dhabi University, with scholarly experience spanning Europe and Southeast Asia. His research sits at the intersection of the colonial thought, Islamic philosophy, and culture studies. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Islam and Global Challenges, Universitas Islam International, Indonesia. His recent publication appears in the American Journal of Islam and Society, 2026, Postcolonial Studies, 2025, and Medieval Encounters, 2025, among many others. He is currently working on a monograph that examines the Abdurrahman Taha philosophy and the stakes it raises for the colonial thought within the Islamic Majal al-Tadawul. So the topic of today's lecture is entitled The Colonial Thought from Within, Abdurrahman Taha, Gaza, and the Ethic of Entrustment. So I give the floor to our esteemed professor to present his talk. The floor is yours, dear professor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed, for the generous introduction, and thank you, Professor Ben Isa, for the generous invitation as well. I'm really happy to be with you here with this wonderful series of talks and workshops organized by the Lisaniyat Institute. It's truly an honor to be here. Before I begin, I want to address something about the title of this talk, because it's already raised some questions when it was circulating online, especially the kind of juxtaposition of Islam and decolonial thought sometimes can trigger an immediate assumption. For instance, the idea that this must be an attempt to Islamize decoloniality. But that assumption already, for me, rests on another kind of fiction. The fiction that some knowledge is kind of neutral and universal, while other knowledges are kind of marked, particular and ideological, or Islamic in that sense. And I think that assumption itself rests on a deeper kind of idea, or I would say fiction, particularly that there exists on one hand kind of a neutral, objective, universal knowledge, and on the other hand, a knowledge that is marked as Islamic, which is particular and wouldn't be able to contribute something to kind of a universalist or a universal understanding of what's happening today. To be honest, I think, and that's part of the argument that I will be making today, I think Gaza has kind of shattered that fantasy with devastating clarity, because Gaza has shown us that what often presents itself as universal in terms of reason or neutral law or objective moral language is in fact already saturated with hierarchy, with selectivity, with power. So my aim today is not really to append Islam to decolonial thought, nor to reduce decolonial thought to an Islamic vocabulary. I want to ask what becomes possible when we take seriously the fact that all thinking emerges from somewhere. And when we allow Islamic ethical traditions, in this case, in the case of my presentation, I mean, to enter into this decolonial conversation, not as an object to be managed or as a case study, but as a site of what I would call conceptual and ethical production, a site from which we can generate other ways of knowing and being and acting. Okay. I chose Gaza as my beginning, or my kind of way, my angle on entering into this debate, because, I mean, many scholars have argued that the genocide in Gaza has exposed the kind of hypocrisy of the so-called West, whatever that may be. They also argue that it has laid bare the idea that universality is only an abstract idea. When it comes to kind of practical political recognition, legal protection, moral outrage, it operates unevenly between different centers of power. So in that sense, Gaza is, for me, is not external. It's not external to this kind of rule-based order. It reveals one of its constitutive tensions, which is the idea that there is a distance, there is a gap between proclaimed universality and between geopolitical selectivity. How do we react and how do we support or unsupport certain actions, especially in the global south and in the Middle East as well? So I want to push this idea a little bit further, because for many of us, I think Gaza did not just reveal the double standard of the West. I mean, this is not something new. I mean, we read history, we know post-colonial critiques of rule-based order. And when I say, by the way, rule-based order, I want us to think about this critically, because the problem is that with Gaza, the problem is that it's not just some actors violate certain rules. I mean, there is a deeper problem that the order presents itself as morally universal while operating through hierarchies of power. And those hierarchies of power decide whose suffering counts, they decide whose self-defense is intelligible, they decide also whose violence is named terrorism and whose violence is named security. And this is part of why Gaza and the Palestinian cause in general has become such a powerful site of intellectual and kind of moral confrontation. But for me also, and I would say that this is still not the novelty. I mean, the shock of the genocide in Gaza resides in another place, which I want to invite us all to think about, because I'm sure that this is not only my experience. I think the novelty of the situation and the shock of the situation reside in the fact that we lost the last remaining bit of belief in the claim that the West can hold any serious commitment to the values it professes that it holds. I mean, values of human rights, rule of law, democratic accountability. I have long known, and I think all of you do as well, that in the region, yes, we don't have democracies, and the West is not really interested in seeing genuine democracies in the region. But we still had the belief that at least in the West, they had democracy. They had freedom of belief, they had participation, they had contestation, they had political accountability, and that they respected freedom of speech, academic freedom, freedom of the press. I think the novelty for me is here, because Gaza has laid bare the fact that this too was just an illusion. I mean, if you look at the deportations, the firing of scholars, the criminalization of dissent and resistance, I mean, the collapsing of almost everything into an accusation of anti-Semitism show that this universal veneer of whatever is it that we call the global north or the west or whatever was really just that, a veneer, something on the outside. And I think that puts us in an exciting but also in a very difficult position, because our task now is to think about those values that we once treated as universal. I mean, and we need to ask what does it mean for us from where we stand right now? For if I no longer need to spend my energy proving the double standard of the kind of West and the way in which it treats the global South and the Middle East, because that double standard now has become visible to anybody who wishes to look at it and actually find it. I think now that kind of energy must be reoriented. It must be channeled toward wrestling individually and collectively, I think, with the question of what values should orient and guide our life once we stop outsourcing that kind of universality to collapsing moral order. That has been kind of, this is why I think Gaza became so central to much recent decolonial thinking and decolonial reflections, because decolonial thinkers have long argued that modern universalism often conceals a structure of exclusion. I mean, this is a very widespread and ubiquitous argument in the field, and that what appears as neutral law or global reason is frequently entangled with colonial histories, racial hierarchies, and epistemic kind of domination. Now, Gaza has made that argument newly visible to a global audience, because with Gaza, it dramatizes, you can see it live, it dramatizes how the language of universality can coexist with management, legitimation, normalization of radical and equal vulnerability. The idea that some people's pain matters and some other people's pain does not matter. At the same time, and one of the things I really want to kind of put out there right now is that I don't really want to reduce Gaza to an illustration of theory. Okay, for me, Gaza is not just a case study for our concepts. It is the event that should kind of unsettle our concepts, unsettle things that we take for granted. It should make us ask whether our inherited vocabularies of human rights and modernity and universality, tolerance, order, all of these are adequate at this point in history, and whether they still carry within them assumptions that must be also rethought in light of what's happening around us. So kind of my talk begins from kind of a simple but demanding question, and I think as you can see on the slide, Gaza is not just a political crisis. For me, and I think for the majority of people who have some sense, any sense of critical thinking, it is a crisis of humanity. It is also a philosophical crisis. It is a crisis of legitimacy, of universality, of a modern vocabulary that no longer can sustain its presumptions on any universal claim. And because the issue before us is not just whether the rule-based order has failed, I think the issue is whether the very form of universality on which it rests has been compromised from the beginning by the historical condition of modernity. Now, this is the particular point where Gaza leads us into the next question that I want to tackle, which is how the post-colonial and decolonial thought diagnose this crisis differently, and why that distinction matter, and also that will show why I positioned myself within the decolonial kind of thinking line, despite the fact that, as we will see, there are a lot of entanglements and intertwinement between the two. Okay, so now, if Gaza has forced us to question the moral credibility of the present order in which we live, I think one of the important questions that we should ask next is what kind of conceptual language actually can help us diagnose that particular crisis. I mean, and this is where the distinction will become much more clearer between post-colonial and decolonial, because the question from which they begin matter a lot. I mean, post-colonial thought, and of course, if you could take a whole semester talking about post-colonial and decolonial thought. So, by necessity, I am going to be a little bit broad. But post-colonial thought, generally speaking, kind of emerged as a critical engagement with the cultural, literary, political, and epistemic aftermath of the colonial rule. So in this sense, it is deeply concerned with questions of representation, of discourse, of identity, of hybridity and ambivalence, subalternity as well, and the persistence of colonial power in a supposedly post-imperial world. In other words, and I would say, post-colonial thought asks how colonialism survives in language, in subjectivity, in institutions, in knowledge, cultural forms, even after formal decolonization has taken place. Now, on the other hand, decolonial thought kind of presses more forcefully on the claim that colonialism didn't simply end and left its residues behind. No, it argues that modernity itself was constituted through colonialism, that coloniality remains an ongoing structure of power, shaping knowledge, economy, race, subjectivity, and the world order in general. So the shift here is from the aftermath of colonialism to the persistence of coloniality as a constitutive dimension of the modern world system. Now, that distinction, I think, is very crucial, because post-colonial critique often works by reading empire through discourse, culture, and the kind of unstable production of identity. Decolonial critique, and I think especially with its Latin American kind of group, like figures like Enrique Dissel, Aníbal Quijano, Walter Bignolo, all of them insist that we cannot understand modernity, for instance, apart from the date 1492, apart from conquest, apart from extraction, epistemicide, apart from the global production of kind of center and periphery. And for that particular reason, decolonial thought tends to be more explicit in naming modernity and coloniality as mutually kind of constitutive, rather than a sequential phenomenon, rather than one after the other. Now, of course, and as I said at the beginning, these distinctions should not be kind of exaggerated into any form of rigid opposition between the two. There is always important overlaps between different traditions. Both of scholars from both traditions kind of cross into each other's field. Okay. Now, despite the fact that, as I said, I position myself within kind of this not emerging, but within the tradition of kind of decolonial thought, I want to kind of suggest that even decolonial thought might not be sufficient to kind of characterize the current crisis, because, I mean, its critique of Eurocentrism is indispensable, of course, but it often remains strongest in negation. I mean, by negation, I mean it remains kind of limited in terms of to exposing domination, to kind of provincializing the West or Europe, whatever, in kind of unveiling the colonial underside of modernity. What becomes harder in this sense is that the question of what kind of affirmative ethical horizon can be built beyond colonial modernity, so without falling back either into abstraction or relativism. So they need to fend off against the idea that everything is relative and there are multiple truths and everybody is entitled to what they say. So this kind of nihilistic relativism, but also they have to deal with the idea of building kind of what they call a pluriversal order, in which the relation between different kinds of ways of knowing and being don't over-empower each other. I mean, don't develop this imperial sense of how you relate to other, which is through domination. And for me, this is precisely where the transition to Taha Abdurrahman becomes important, because once Taha enters that terrain, we can see that through his scholarship that he has some overlaps already with decolonial thought. So I'm not claiming that Taha self-identifies as decolonial. No, my point is that the way in which I approach Taha is somebody who has made contribution to the concerns of decolonial thought. I mean, critiques of Eurocentrism, critiques of taqlid or imitation, epistemic domination, the critiques of Western modernity. But the thing that differentiates Taha from the decolonial thought in general is that he starts from a different He has a different departure. He starts from a different point, because he does not simply ask how modernity dominates. He asks what kind of ethical and spiritual regrounding would make another modernity possible. And that's the important question that he asks, because so just to something that I remember, to go back to the distinction. So the distinction really, for me at least, between post-colonial and decolonial matters only in terms of classification. I mean, it matters because it affects how we understand, for instance, we could understand Gaza through the different, through those lenses, how we understand the present condition, so how we imagine the horizon after or beyond critique. And if post-colonial thought helps us read the afterlife of empire, I think decolonial thought help us name the persistence of coloniality and the very structure of things that we see now in modernity in general. And I think once we understand the relation between the two to the present in this way, the question that came to my head and I just really wanted to wrestle with was whether an Islamic ethical project can intervene in that debate. What can it contribute to that debate in a way that is not merely reactive to it, but actually reconstructive in terms of building a new project? Okay. Now, why Taha matters, at least to my in my understanding. I think Taha matters here not simply as another critic of the West. Okay, he's a thinker who believes that the crisis of modernity is at its deepest level an ethical crisis. And the point, I think the point is essential, because many critics of modernity focus on power, on political economy, colonial domination, epistemic violence. But Taha is definitely aware of this kind of different interventions. But his intervention begins from a different intuition that modernity cannot be adequately understood if we treat it only as an institutional arrangement or as a historical process, like in a teleological sense. It must also be confronted as a moral and spiritual formation. So in decolonial terms, as a way of being human, as a way of knowing, of acting, of inhabiting the world otherwise, in a different way. And in that sense, Taha is not merely critiquing Western dominance from the outside. I mean, he is asking a more demanding question, like, what kind of subject has modernity produced, and what has been lost when reason becomes detached from ethics? I mean, or we could also say, when freedom is severed from responsibility, when critique becomes empty of any spiritual depth. And here I want to pause on something really quickly. I want to pause on the word spiritual, because I know that for many of us, it triggers kind of this ambivalence in the head, because I would even say it kind of generates a sense of discomfort, especially when you're using it with the critical language of decolonial and post-colonial thought, because the very language of spirituality now has been adulterated. I mean, now it is automatically contrasted with materiality. It generates this image in our head of wellness lifestyle, self-help, personal balance. It is emptied of any sense of insurgency, of any sense of revolutionary potential. And that happens when we forget our social embeddedness. For instance, if we look back at history, many, in the case of Morocco, many Sufi orders and resistance movements in this region were at the heart of the anti-colonial struggle against French and British colonialism. The idea that if the word spiritual immediately brings to your head the idea of seclusion, the idea of being a hermit, like some privatized yoga, meditation, imaginary. If something like this pops in your head when you hear the word spiritual, then we really have to ask seriously where that imaginary come from and what it has left behind, what it has erased from our hand. Because in our tradition, the Islamic tradition, the idea of a zuhd, or renunciation. The idea of renunciation is only a very small facet of the spiritual world. I mean, it's not the totality of it. The importance of the spirit or ruh or spirituality, for instance, in the philosophy of Taha Rahman, lies precisely in the way in which it does away with this distinction between internal refinement and external struggle, between what we could call the worldly and the other worldly. I mean, the physical and the metaphysical, because his target is not only Eurocentrism in a kind of a geopolitical sense, but the reduction of the human to an instrumental, self-authorizing, materially oriented subject. The human being in modernity for him is stripped of that side which extends beyond the body. And this is, for me, why Taha's projects cannot really be reduced to any criticism of reaction or nostalgia of living in the past, because he is not calling for a simple return to the past, nor is he offering any kind of form of romantic civilizational refusal of everything that is modern. For me and for many of his people who study his thought, he insists that there is something in modernity worth rescuing. And that's also one of the points from which he, not consciously, but for me, from which he detaches or kind of derail from the decolonial trajectory. Because for decolonial thinkers, modernity is a lost cause. There is some kind of disagreement over the points, but generally modernity is something to do away with. For Taha, this is not the case, as we will see, because he repeatedly makes the distinction between the spirit or ruh al-hadath, the spirit of modernity, and its historical reality, and its historical manifestation or application. The spirit here refers to the kind of principles such as intellectual maturity, critique, universality, and the reality of it refers to the way in which the specific Euro-American tradition have applied those principles historically. how they have embodied them. And in his view, it is often a distorted embodiment because it's operated mainly on materialism, instrumentalism, secular domination, and kind of what we would call colonial arrogance. So for the grounding of modernity in a very in different tradition, often for him, for at least, of course, it comes through the Islamic tradition, but the Islamic tradition itself is understood in his thought not as a kind of museum of inherited ideas and doctrines, but for him it is a tradition is alive. It is a living reservoir of ethical, linguistic, and metaphysical possibilities. So tradition for him is not the enemy of renewal, but it is the medium through which renewal becomes possible. It is the thing that you use as your springboard, as your basis. And this brings us to one of his most important ideas, which is the idea of ibda, or creativity. I mean, Zaha argues that true modernity is not an imitation. It is not about catching up with this ideal, which is all the time Western, and it's not about the repetition of the European path and their different local conditions. I mean, true modernity is creative, but creative in a connected sense, which he calls al-ibda' al-mawsul. In a connected sense, which means it is connected to one's language, it is connected to one's metaphysical orientation, it is connected to our ethical inheritance. I mean, it is connected to our communal life world. And this allows him, for instance, to oppose both blind traditionalism, which just wants to imitate and bring back the past to the present, and also blind imitation of other projects, other modern projects, which have different historical realities than our. So in this precise sense, we can see that Taha's project kind of offers a double critique in the Khatibian sense. It's not only about it's not only concerned with critiquing, but it's also concerned with reconstruction, with building foundation to be able to kind of develop an indigenous and endemic modern project, which is still connected to our tradition and to our kind of majal tadawuli. Okay. Now, I have been using the word ethic and ethical, and I thought that this is a good opportunity for me to kind of clarify something about the philosophy of Taha, especially for people who are just beginning to read him. If you are familiar with kind of different scholarship about the way in which philosophy has envisioned ethics, generally, this has started to be challenged recently, but ethics has for the longest part was an appendix to philosophy. And this is something that Taha really disagrees with. This is at the core of his project, because for him it is not something. Ethics are not something that you add after knowledge has been produced, as though like we first think and then only later ask question whether that thinking was good or harmful or whatever. For him, ethics is built into the very act of thinking itself. There is no thinking without ethics. And this is why the language of entrustment matters so much to his entire project, because the human being for him is not, first of all, a sovereign knower, standing above the things that they study. I mean, it is not. You're not a neutral, self-authorizing subject which stands outside of history, outside of the social embeddedness of the things that you want to study. No, as a human being, in the falsafa al-i'timani of Taha, you are entrusted. You are a mu'taman. مؤتمن means a bearer of al-amana, so a bearer of trust. And so even knowledge in that sense is never innocent in advance. It is always answerable to what it does to the self, to what it does to others, and to what it does to the world. And that means that we are first and foremost a moral subject. And in that sense, if you look at it this way, like you are a subject whose very way of knowing is already bound to a responsibility. So thinking itself in this sense becomes a site of answerability, not just a mastery. And this will become much clearer when I want to talk about the way in which the Western intellectual tradition have approached the idea of nature and ecology as something to be mastered and possessed, rather than something that is entrusted to us to kind of cultivate and thrive. And I think one of the important if we redefine human beings as entrusted rather than a sovereign, and somebody who is a bearer of amana, and amana in this sense is anything that we do, anything that we possess, anything that we have, thinking, speaking, acting, ways of knowing, ways of being, the way in which we regulate our life. So if we redefine the human being in that sense, which Taha philosophy does, this kind of a further question opens itself, because what kind of reason follow from that? What kind of rationality can we develop based on a human being whose very anthropology is an anthropology of a mu'taman? That's its own makeup. Because if we perceive the subject as somebody who is not autonomous, as somebody who is not a self-grounded subject of modernity, then reason itself cannot remain what modernity has often made it to be, which is detached, which is abstract reason, which is falsely universal, of course, as we can see with the double standard when it comes to the rule-based order in terms of how it applies laws to people in the global north and people in the global south. And this is where I think Taha's notion of supported reason becomes so important, because what he calls al-aql al-mu'ayyad is not as it is always perceived that is something that is anti-reason. It is not irrationality. It is a reason that is ethically bound, spiritually grounded, and open to the idea of plural rationalities. It is not an imperial reason that wants to dominate. Okay, so what Taha was doing when this is what I think, what Taha was doing when he was kind of developing this idea of al-aql al-mu'ayyad, he was not, because he critiques abstract reason, he was not only exposing kind of the Eurocentric underpinning of abstract reason, but he was asking also what kind of alternative rationality could sustain a genuinely different future. And he offers one of the answers. Of course, it is not the answer, but it is one of the legitimate answers. And kind of this movement in Taha, from critique to reconstruction, or from denunciation to kind of refounding and regrounding, it is precisely here that I want to kind of this is the point which I took from him to develop what I called ruh politics. Now, before I move to ruh politics, let's talk about something called ego politics, because that is the contrast in which I was writing against. The question I wanted to ask is, what happens when politics is no longer organized around kind of the sovereign ego, the possessive ego, but around the idea of ruh, of spirit, of entrustment, of ethical responsibility? What kind of world can we imagine? What changes? And I think what changes is not simply that the content of politics will change, but kind of the very anthropology. Its account of what a human being is will definitely change. Its account of power, what is power, will definitely change. And of course, I think much more importantly, what collective life is supposed to cultivate. any cursory look at modern politics, especially in its secular and kind of liberal forms, begin from a certain figure of the subject, the individual, the autonomous self. The rights-bearing individual, as we know with Locke and Hume. The idea of the self-authorizing agent who claims mastery over the world, over meaning, over action. And even when this subject is placed inside institutions, inside rights regimes, inside democratic procedures, it remains fundamentally organized around the idea of possession, of entitlement, of sovereignty, of control. The political question here then becomes how these egos can be coordinated, how they can be limited, how they can be represented or balanced. The democratic process becomes about how do we check the power of those people, of those agents. And a good example to have here, you can see this kind of ego politics very clearly in how states talk about security. Well, for instance, when a government justifies almost any measure in the name of what they call, we have been hearing this, our national interest or our security or protecting our way of life, what is being centered here is the sovereign ego. The self that understands the word primarily as something to be defended against, as something to be managed and controlled. The question is not first like what is just or what is entrusted to us. It is how do we secure ourselves, even if that security comes at the cost of others. And I think even when this language is wrapped in democratic procedures and rights discourse, like the underlying point, the underlying grammar, the underlying structure remains the same, which is possession, entitlement, control, and the kind of the coordination of different competing egos. Now think. I'm inviting you all to think with me, for instance, of how easily the language of self-defense is mobilized, especially recently, to authorize massive asymmetries of violence, with the case of Gaza. The sovereign ego here is not even questioned. What is questioned is only its limits, and that was very kind of shocking for me, because the deeper assumption was that one side owns the right to define what is a threat, to decide whose life amount to something, whose life matter, and to name its own violence as necessary, and remains untouched. That is ego politics in its clearest format. Now, with Taha, I wanted to imagine a kind of a different world. What would it look like if we move from this ego political side towards something much more oriented toward his philosophy? I know that I probably have taken much more time than I need, but I will try to wrap it up soon. Okay, so we can leave room for question. Okay, I was talking about points of departures, and one of the things that I think once we start to understand that a human being was not constituted to be a sovereign ego, but somebody who is a bearer of trust, of al-amana. Politics can no longer be imagined as the management of competing wills between different egos. It becomes directly an arena of moral accountability, of relational obligation, and also, I think, irresponsible inhabitation of the world. And this is what I called in my recent article a move from ego politics to ruh politics. So if ego politics names a political order that is grounded in self-assertion, that is grounded in domination, in abstraction, in the will to control and organize the world from the standpoint of the individual autonomous subject, ruh politics, on the other hand, It names a horizon in which politics is reordered by ethical self-transformation, or by what Taha called tazkiyah. And from within, through this tazkiyah, the development of the cultivation of responsibility before a higher order of justice, which you can call before God, before the others, before creation, but before a higher, and in our case, a transcendental order of creation, of justice. Now, that does not mean, and I know that this question will be raised, this doesn't mean that politics become a form of quietism or like simply inward, internal kind of thinking or management or whatever. It is actually quite the opposite, because one of the kind of most important misconceptions to avoid here is the assumption that spiritual language necessarily depoliticizes struggle. I mean, in Taha's framework, at least to my understanding, the ruh of the spirit is not an escape from the world. I mean, it's not what prevents action from degenerating into domination. It disciplines power. The ruh disciplines power by binding it to an ethical purpose. And by refusing the fantasy that efficacy alone is enough to justify political action. I mean, what he calls الائتمانية it's not just a moral metaphor. It's not something that is utopian. It is a full ethical paradigm. It redefines the human being as one who has accepted responsibility, rather than the one who naturally possesses sovereignty, just for the fact that they were born. I mean, the world itself is no longer raw material for extraction or control, but the world itself becomes a trust, an amana, a field of science, a field of relations, and I would say obligations as well, because these obligations must be safeguarded and cultivated rather than dominated. Authority itself is no longer justified by what we call in political science procedural legitimacy or force or the majoritarian will. It must also answer to whether it deepens justice, it deepens mercy, it deepens the idea of truthfulness, of fidelity, of ethical formation. I mean, political reason, I mean, to talk broadly, political reason itself is no longer sufficient. It is because it's no longer sufficient if we only perceive it as being strategic, things to, like a means to an end. It must become morally answerable. Otherwise, we will still experience different kind of crisis as we are witnessing today. Okay. I'm going to end on something important. One of by the way, a lot of the critiques of Abd al-Rahman comes from the idea that his project is too ideal, too detached, too the utopian, is concerned with the spirit, but not the struggle, so on and so forth. I think one of the ways in which Taha's project becomes politically radical in a deeper sense, and I would say in a deeper sense, more than a lot of secular critiques of modernity, because Taha is not simply asking for a more humane politics. Like, he's not asking for a more humane politics within the same metaphysical architecture that have produced the genocide. Okay, he's not asking for something to change within the same paradigm. He is asking us to reconsider the very grammar of political life itself. So instead of beginning from the isolated subject and asking how can we order, or how can we put how can a more just order be imposed, he begins with the idea of the covenant or al-mithaq, which which has built into it the idea of trust, the idea of co-responsibility, and asks how a just world can be sustained through them. And I think that has a lot of consequences for decolonial thought, because much decolonial thought, much decolonial critique rightly exposes domination, it exposes hierarchy, it exposes epistemic violence. Yes, but it often leaves open the question of what kind of subjects can inhabit a world beyond colonial modernity. What happens after it? And Taha's answer is that such a world cannot be built by the same ego that colonial modernity has produced. It requires another mode of succession. It requires a new human in the Fanonian sense. It requires another mode of subjectivity, another relation to truth, another understanding of reason, and of course another ethos of coexistence. To my mind, I think this is the significance of Ruh politics as I was inspired when I kind of developed it from Taha's projects, because it is not an attempt to displace the ego as the hidden sovereign. It is an attempt to displace the ego as the hidden sovereign of modern political thought. Now, I still have a few things to go through, but I think I will be able to kind of address them during the question session. I have gone for like 15 minutes, and I think now it's time to open the space for questions.
Sorry, Dr. Idrisi, it's not a problem. If you need some more minutes, it's not a problem. You can continue.
Oh, can I go for like another 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, this is the second project that is about to be published, is the idea of pluriversality and the way in which we can contribute to it from within the kind of Islamic intellectual tradition. By pluriversality, it is usually meant like a world in which many words would fit. It is a decolonial horizon that kind of affirm irreducible and pluriversal ways of knowing, of being, beyond this kind of postmodern definition of plurality and relativism, which still operates, as many postcolonial critiques have shown, within a very Eurocentric frame of knowledge. I think specifically when it comes to pluriversality, I think the first thing to say is that the contribution of Taha's philosophy or of the Islamic intellectual tradition to the kind of this debate should not be taken as a case study. I mean, something that is inserted into an already existing decolonial framework. For me, I think the Islamic intellectual tradition can itself generate a distinct account of pluriversality, and one that is grounded not in the idea of liberal tolerance or kind of procedural coexistence, but in the covenant in reciprocity and in ethical responsibility in terms of how we relate to difference. And that distinction is important because in much decolonial thought, pluriversality names the refusal of a single universal horizon that is imposed by Europe, and the kind of and the idea is to affirm multiple ways of knowing, of being, and of what they call worldling. Now, that is a crucial move because pluriversality often remains vulnerable to this kind of unresolved questions. For instance, what gives the pluriversal world a basis for relation? I mean, how do we relate to each other? How do we encounter one another in a world without domination? And kind of what prevents plurality from collapsing again, either into relativism, the postmodern fantasy, or into this kind of managed diversity under a new hegemonic framework, as we know from the debates of multiculturalism in Europe and the United States, so on and so forth. Now, I think Taha's philosophy, and especially in his book Ruh ad-Din, I think it was published in 2012. In 2012, yes, it offers one of the possible answers to this kind of question. His intervention suggests that plurality cannot really be sustained by epistemic difference alone. We require kind of a different ethical grammar, and for him, not for him, but based on my understanding of his work, a pluriverse really cannot endure simply because many words exist. It must also be held together by something, by modes of responsibility that kind of govern how those words meet, that's how they speak, how they disagree, but also, and much more importantly, how do they remain accountable to one another. And from within kind of the, if we look to answer this question from within the kind of Islamic tradition, the answer will definitely not be kind of tolerance, or at least tolerance as a very secular concept, because one of the strongest aspects of Taha's argument is his critique of tolerance in his book Ruh ad-Din. I mean, tolerance in its liberal modern sense often presupposes a kind of what we could call an asymmetry of power, because one party permits the existence of the other. One party endures the other. They manage them, they withhold coercion from them, so they have power over them, usually a minority. So it does not necessarily recognize the other as inhabiting a valid horizon of meaning on its own terms. No. So tolerance in this sense can remain hierarchical even when it appears to be generous, even when it appears to be accommodating. I mean, think for instance of how many states approach Islamic traditions as objects to be regulated through the idea, through the practice of what they call security dossier, integration policies, assimilation policies, or recently with the idea of moderation programs, rather than a covenantal partner whose ethical word must also be engaged on its unequal terms. To be honest, when it comes to this kind of question, I think Taha's alternative is much more demanding, because he shifts from tolerance to kind of what I called, based on his work, covenantal reciprocity. And the idea that you move from a passive allowance to an active ethical recognition. So the other is not someone that I merely put up with. The other is someone who is right to affirm their own path I must respect, precisely because I seek the same respect for my own. This is why reciprocity becomes much more kind of a moral virtue, because it becomes the very condition of a covenantal pluriverse. It kind of it draws the path of how do we encounter each other in a world that is beyond domination. Now, based on this understanding, I really I didn't venture to imagine pluriversality as something that is the coexistence of isolated differences under a secular canopy, like what we have with the discourses of multiculturalism and so on and so forth. For me, and based on my understanding of Taha's work, it is something that must be rethought and must be based on the idea of entrustment, on the idea of ethical discipline, on the idea of self-cultivation, on the idea that truth itself is not approached through a it's approached through morally formed subjects, rather than a detached sovereign mind. The idea here is that no truth is imperial. The will of truth is not to dominate. I mean, the result of that understanding could be a possible pluriversal path. Now, the last thing I wanted to, the last thing I will cover quickly before I open the floor for question is the idea that Taha calls التكاثر العقلي. And that is one of the important, really most important ideas in his thoughts in terms of how it relates to our definition of truth. Because one of the things that is about Islamic thought is often read, or I would say misread, as either being a totalitarian universalism or kind of cultural particularism. It's only something that belongs to the Islamic world or something that has this imperial will to dominate. And I think Taha shows that the Islamic framework can actually sustain a strong commitment to truth and ethical formation, while also at the same time opening a space for plural rationalities, a space for multiple worlds, and space for reciprocal coexistence. And because based on his definition of التكاثر العقلي, we can say that the pluriverse is not simply composed of different opinions about different opinions about one world. Sorry. The world can be composed of different rational orders, different moral ontologies, different ways of receiving and inhabiting reality. I mean, that has supported reason makes room for this by refusing the claim that one abstract form of reason has the right to educate every horizon of truth, has the right to tell us what is true and what is not true, whose suffering counts and whose suffering doesn't count. Reason here becomes plural but not chaotic. It is differentiated but not disconnected from ethic. So to rethink really pluriversality from within the Islamic intellectual tradition is to insist that plurality needs more than recognition. It's not that I recognize that you have a different opinion than me. It doesn't end there. It needs entrustment. It needs a moral discipline. It needs an account of dialogue in which engagement with the other transforms the self rather than merely confirming one's own superiority over the other. And this needs a conception of truth that is neither monopolized by a single civilizational center, Islamic or whatever, nor it is dissolved into these endless equivalences that everybody has a truth, and it's this idea of crazy nihilistic nihilistic relativism. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm really looking forward for some of the questions. As for the other ideas that I wanted to discuss, I think I will be able to bring them up during the Q&A session. I'm sorry if I took so long.
So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would love to thank Beit Lisaniyat Academy and its teams and its organizers for giving us this opportunity to connect with great professors and scholars. And please excuse my voice, like I lost it yesterday in the match, so I'm really sorry. So I'd love to congratulate Dr. Ashraf Idrisi on this insightful presentation and on casting light on such a timely and important and interesting topic. And actually, by the way, I'm planning soon to add a part in my dissertation to talk about the Palestinian people in relation with displacement, collective memory, and intergenerational trauma. So this lecture was an inspiration for me actually to do more, to read more about the Palestinian people and their background and so on and so forth. So in this lecture, Dr. Idrisi began by examining Gaza not as a case study, but as a symbol that challenges the legitimacy of so-called universality. inviting us to rethink concepts of justice, protection, and resistance. He then distinguished between post-colonial and decolonial thought before introducing the philosophy of Abdurrahman Taha as an Islamic ethical framework centered on modernity, entrustment, and spirituality. Building on these ideas, he presented the concept of ruh politics or spiritual politics as an Islamic approach to decolonial agency and seeking an Islamic decolonial vision grounded not in control or mastery, but on ethical responsibility, reconstruction, and creativity. So please allow me to pose the following two questions. The first question is that you argue that spiritual politics offers an Islamic alternative within decolonial thought. So how do you envision this concept moving beyond the philosophical reflection into practical social action precisely in contemporary Muslim society? Second question, in what way has Gaza fundamentally changed the conceptual framework of decolonial thought rather than simply reinforcing, repeating the existing critique of coloniality? And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for very insightful questions. The first question I will address actually was posed to I attended the reading about Taha's book Ruhuddin, and one of the professors from the audience asked almost a similar question, but about Taha's work. So how do I imagine ruh politics taking effect in kind of the contemporary world? One of the things that in the article in which I wrote about ruh politics, by the way, one of the things, my background is cultural studies. So I did my MA in cultural studies in Morocco. So I'm very much infatuated with literature and culture and so on and so forth. Yeah. And I noticed that one of the critiques that Taha receives all the time was that his ideas are not applicable to reality. It just remains he critiques abstract reason, but his ideas are ideal and utopian in a world that is mired by economic inequalities and the burdens of everyday life. So one of the things that I wanted to look at was the way in which his concepts could be applied to analyze culture, but also to analyze the idea of resistance. Because if you look at the literature of resistance, especially in the region, it is always mired in the idea that resistance has kind of a secular basis. That resistance cannot be intimately tied to this idea of inner transformation or self-transformation. I mean, it cannot enable ethical self-cultivation because resistance is always understood in a kind of procedural sense now, especially in kind of modern political science. It's understood in terms of democracy, in terms of like contestation, protesting, holding people accountable. One of the things that I see that I want to bring back with this notion of ruh politics, and I think which can be applied by people who belong to the Islamic tradition, is that we need to do away with this idea that that our understanding of resistance is necessarily derailed from this idea of inner development. The worldly and the otherworldly doesn't disengage in the way in which I understood ruh politics and its relation to agency and resistance. And I think I know that this is probably not true, but when I first read that particular part where Taha critiques tolerance and kind of hinges on this idea of ruh politics, the only ayah that came to my mind was that لا يغير الله ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. The idea that change starts from the self as the heart of the social unit of society. We always expect change to take effect when it is collective action. Now, that is not the way in which Taha understands it in the Quran itself. The idea that we need more, we need global, we need collective mobilization for change to take effect is simply not true. And that's something that we really get from the works of Taha, at least in a much more kind of clear sense. Now, your second question was about, I'm sorry, can you repeat it?
Okay. In what ways has Gaza fundamentally changed or transformed the conceptual framework of decolonial thought rather than simply reinforcing critiques of coloniality?
Yeah. See, as I said at the beginning, this is not the first time that we know that the kind of West has this double standard toward the region. This is something that we can read in history. We know the way in which it selects. For me, at least, what Gaza has made clear is the fact that I believe that many others still believe that, yes, despite the fact that they might be dealing with countries in the global south selectively and with double standard, at least they respected the democratic process in their country. At least they had freedom of speech. At least they can hold the president accountable. At least a journalist can write a piece critiquing a certain president or Israel or whatever. But now we know that it's not the case. The professors have been fired. Journalists have been thrown in prison. We know that within their society, they have lost that as well. Or probably it was never there to begin with. So now Gaza, for me, shattered the whole picture. Because we were aware, post-colonial critics, we were aware of what's the first part. The second part, I think that is the novelty of the shock with Gaza now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful clarification. I just want to add something. Like, since you start, like from the very beginning of your presentation, I got something in mind when you were like talking about Taha's ideas, perfect and utopian and abstract, ideas. Like, it reminds me of Homi Bhabha's concept of in-betweenness and the third space. Like, he calls for a perfect integration between, the third people, or, the West and the East. But his ideas remains actually theoretical. In practice, it takes time and it takes a lot of effort so that, it's not easy like to have that mixing, to have that hybridity and integration at once. You see?
Yeah, and I think maybe to clarify that a little more, I said that a lot of critics of Taha actually accuses him of utopianism and idealism or whatever. Why? That comes from how they understand a human being to be ethical or spiritual. Their understanding of being spiritual is to be a hermit who go maybe to a mosque or whatever. You're secluded. You have no engagement with the political. Their understanding of spiritual is apolitical. But that's not, at least, not only with Taha. As I said, if we look at our history in the region, most of the Sufi lodges in Morocco, most of the Sufi orders were huge contributors to anti-colonial resistance. They were fighters. They smuggled weapons. They mobilized against colonialism. Yes. They were Sufi orders. They were centers of spiritual growth and self-cultivation. So the idea that to be spiritual is to be detached from the world, that's a very small facet of what that means to be spiritual. And I think that's a misunderstanding of Taha's work.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Idrisi. And now I'd like to give the floor to our colleague.
Professor, I have another question for the esteemed professor. Do the current global shifts between nations like the US and China and other nations suggest like a genuine decolonization, or does coloniality persist regardless of which country dominates?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, which actually needs its own separate lecture. There are global shifts in terms of how countries now align themselves. Because, for instance, countries in the Gulf region understood and discovered that their so-called bodyguard cannot really function as a bodyguard. I mean, they have been attacked when they were under the protection of, the US and, the idea. So, yes, there are shifting patterns. There will be different alignments. A lot of people, for the past 10, 15 years, a lot of political scientists have been speaking about the multipolar world. The colonial thinkers have been speaking about the pluriversal world. I don't think that the dominance of the United States will end anytime soon. One of the things, at least I'm speaking from the region where I'm located now, one of the things that we start to see in the Gulf is the kind of disintegration of this Gulf identity, because each of them now no longer perceive themselves as a collective, which we used to call the Gulf. They have different alignments. So either Pakistan and India, China, Israel, different things are happening around the region. Now, we will definitely start to look at a decentered world. We will start to see different alignments which challenge US dominance in the economy, in terms of the mobilization of oil in the region. Iran will emerge also as a key player if it aligned itself with Russia and China. So we will start to see different changes. But beyond that, really, I wouldn't venture to make any claim. It still seems really unclear to me. At least this is what I think.
Thank you, dear professor. And what is the position of the Islamic world in this construction of the multipolar world?
Well, to be honest, I don't really like the term the Islamic world. It is homogenizing, because if you look, for instance, the way in which Morocco positions itself in North Africa, right? And I mean, the way in which it composes and cultivates its religious identity. If you look just on the way in which now the religious vocabulary are mobilized within the World Cup, the idea of values, of prostrating before God, the importance of mothers, all of this is the opposite. It's a different word from what happened for instance, in the Emirates. The way in which it builds its own citizen, the way in which it kind of imagines what does it mean to be a citizen in here. I wouldn't call it Islamic in that sense. Yes, these are countries which have people who profess the Islamic faith, right? But to be truly Islamic, you need an alignment of a political order, you need a lot of things, which up until now, there isn't any kind of unifying thread between these countries, which we call the Islamic world, other than the fact that they are Muslim majority countries. So what will be their contribution to this kind of multipolar world? Well, it seems to be that they will still be playing the role of aligning with somebody rather than being the one who the others align with. I mean, I think we are still far away from really contributing to a genuinely decolonial kind of pluriversal understanding of relationality between, partly because of our condition. I mean, one of the really important questions that was asked, I remember I was in this philosophy conference, and one of the audience was really, you can see anger in his face, and he was like, you continue talking about Hegel and Locke and Rahman and Heidegger and blah, blah, blah. What does that tell us about the people who cannot even find what to eat, who must think every day of, how am I going to survive to the next day? What does it contribute to the people who can't even get a bus ticket or whatever? So he asks a question which left the audience dumbfounded, because it articulated something which is unfortunately very prominent in our region: the detachment of the university of knowledge production from the everyday reality of the people. What effect does it have on them? So I think I think in the Arab world, we still need to wrestle with these questions before we really move into a genuine kind of decolonial understanding of multipolar world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Martra. Thank you, Dr. Idrisi, for that truly transformative and thought-provoking presentation. You have masterfully navigated the complex intellectual landscape by replacing Moroccan philosopher الرحمن in explicit dialogue with decolonial thought. You have illuminated a path that is often overlooked. I think that this lecture raised several questions. We have in the chat box many questions, but I will just add one question from my side, and we will end the lecture. I want you to tell me, or for researchers and students of Islamic thoughts, what is the first step in moving beyond merely studying Taha's Abdurrahman's philosophy to actually think with him, and how can we begin to operationalize concepts like the entrustment paradigm and the ethics of converts in our academic and community work, and how this philosophy of Taha is different from Marxists' ideas or from secular ideas as well?
Well, as I said before, one of the critiques of Taha was the idea that his philosophy is detached and it's not applicable. And I think part of what I do in my work and part of what the students or researchers can do is to, and this is to answer your question of personalization, is to develop concepts out of his work and operationalize them in terms of critiques and analysis of culture, of politics, of history, of colonial history, and also of the idea of future developments of knowledge. Okay, so we don't really just study the work of Taha to kind of validate that it is right or wrong or whatever. That's not the point. The point is, for instance, when you apply a concept from Taha, you show the limits of that concept. And when you understand the limits of that concept, you have a chance to develop things beyond those limits because you demarcate, and that demarcation is your point of departure. That's your contribution. And also, one of the things that I really advise researchers to do is not to approach thinkers in the Islamic world with the idea that I am approaching this thinker to find a decolonial concept or a decolonial eye. No, let the text speak to you. For instance, one of the thinkers, and I really advise people who are listening, who are interested in doing research on this, is to look at the work of the Tunisian thinker, philosopher, Abu Ya'rib al-Marzuqi. His project, one of the things that fascinates me about his project is how synthesizing it is. I mean, he and Taha are kind of philosophers who write not in a specific field. Yes, they started like that, but then they developed a theory of knowledge. They develop an ethical paradigm. They have their own philosophy. And that's something that it's really missing from a lot of thinkers in the region. And that's something that also you see in a lot of Western 19th, 18th century thinkers that developed paradigms which aims to explain every facet of. So that's something that Taha does. And that's something that differentiates the work of Taha, as he asked, from many other secular, especially modern. It's very rare to find modern projects which have this synthesizing perspective to them.
So thank you so much, dear professor, dear audience. We come to the end of this lecture, and I would like to thank deeply and profoundly our dear esteemed professor for this insightful and informative, thought-provoking lecture, in which you talked about like a multidisciplinary field which like under investigation, and it's an opportunity and invitation for researcher to explore it more by doing research on this. So the floor is yours, dear professor, for your final words.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind of invitation. I was really happy to be with you today. I can see that there are a few other comments, and please, I encourage you to either email me or write to me on Facebook or whatever, wherever you find me. Just send me those questions. I will be happy to answer you, and I will be happy actually if we can develop something and work and publish together. I'm really open to working with anybody. Okay, as long as they are interested in what they are doing. So thank you all for inviting me, and I hope we will see each other again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Matua. Thank you, Dr. Idrisi, for accepting our invitation and for your efforts in preparing and delivering this presentation. Thanks also to our supervisors, coordinating teams, for their great efforts and for facilitating such a series of lectures and conferences. A special thanks to also to Yasmin Shara, who was reporting this lecture, and Ahmed Martua, who was moderating. And thanks again. We hope we see you, inshallah, in our upcoming events, Dr. Idrisi. Beit Lisania is always open towards discussing such ideas. What we like in these lectures is questions that are raised. We are not looking for answers, but it's that is the best part is the questions when scholars are thinking about what shall I do next. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation again.
Thank you, dear professor.
Thank you.
Yes, Mina. Any words?
Actually, I'd love to say I'm very happy to be among all of you. And actually, as I said in the beginning, Dr. Idrisi's presentation was very inspirational for me, because I will be soon working kind of on the Palestinian context. Even though it is about displacement, as I said, and intergenerational trauma, but attending this lecture, being part of it, helped me a lot to have some interesting background. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to see you once again. And as Dr. Idrisi said, why not working together in future?
Inshallah.
Thank you. Yes, sure.
Thank you.
So see you in kind coming webinars and lectures. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.